So with the Advent and Christmas seasons upon us, I thought it would be fun to do a quick look at how children's books tend to treat the Christmas story. We've been looking recently at a lot of Bible storybooks, which by definition contain a variety of stories from the Bible. And often some part of the Christmas story is included as one or two or three of the stories in that book. But of course, there are many children's books that offer a single story from the Bible. And the single story that seems to be most often chosen is the Christmas story. So we're going to take a quick look at how that story is treated in a selection of books, and maybe have an honorable mention for the nativity toys I keep seeing advertised. There are some patterns that are often repeated and some common misconceptions that are perpetuated, and we will look at both. A couple notes before we look at the books. First, for the sake of academic rigor, I do want to point out that scholars debate the accuracy of the accounts in Matthew and Luke. We are gonna sidestep this debate and suggest that whatever their level of accuracy, the authors of the Gospel would have been describing things based on their context. We are going to try to understand that context better so that we can better picture what they were trying to describe. Second, a lot of what we think we know about the Christmas story actually comes from later traditions and not the accounts of Matthew and Luke. I am all for considering tradition as a source. Some traditions may preserve knowledge that was handed down orally, for example, and earlier traditions especially can give us insight to how people closer to the time of the account understood it. However, a lot of the traditions that shape our modern understanding of the Christmas story are from quite a bit later, 8th century and later, and tend to be shaped more by their own world than by the ancient accounts. We will point out a few of the errors and give some corrections here, but if you want more detailed explanations, I'll add some helpful links in the description for further reading and listening. So let's talk about some of the common misconceptions that show up in our stories and give some corrective suggestions from history, geography, and archaeology. First, the location and look of Bethlehem. Because many of us in Europe and North America experience Christmas in the winter, it's not uncommon for us to picture snow. Most of the stories that I've seen that purport to be set in Bethlehem recognize that snow there would be unusual and don't show it, but many will still reference a cold winter's night. Our traditional date for Christmas is unlikely to be accurate. Far better arguments can be made in favor of spring or fall, so it's likely the weather was fairly temperate. My second quibble with how Bethlehem is portrayed has to do with a combination of geography and archaeology. The least accurate books tend to have an open-air stable in a field far from the actual town, which is just silly, even though this image has become iconic, showing up in books and ornaments and cards. The more accurate books tend to still favor a too modern architecture, Byzantine or later rather than 1st century, and often place Bethlehem at the foot of the hill rather than the top of the hill. My last complaint is common with almost all depictions of Bible stories. It's either too green or too barren. Bethlehem can be green, but even at its greenest, it doesn't have a carpet of pure green grass everywhere. There should be rocks and shrubs, and there should be more olive trees than palm trees. The Inn and the Innkeeper. A common character in Christmas plays is the innkeeper, or the innkeeper's wife, who cruelly declares there's no room for you in the inn, but is eventually persuaded to allow the Holy Family to use the dirty old stable. Often there is commentary on how Jesus was born in a lowly stable instead of a palace, or encouragement for us to welcome Jesus in, unlike the innkeeper. The problem is there is no such character in the biblical accounts. In fact, there is no inn. The word commonly translated as inn would be better translated as guest room. Let's consider the cultural context. Joseph is going to Bethlehem because that's where his family is from. So likely he still has family there. And of course, he will stay with his family. Even if there were a public inn of some sort in Bethlehem, that wouldn't have been where they headed. And if that's what Luke had meant to imply, he could have used a different word: the stable. So, Joseph's family allows them to stay, but forces them to sleep in the stable? It doesn't sound like a very warm welcome. But again, we must consider the context. And this brings me back to my quibbles over how Bethlehem is portrayed. The stable is usually depicted as a standalone building, often far from other buildings. And again, this is not historically accurate. Sometimes a stable might be in a cave some distance from a house, but more often the stable was a room within the house where animals could be housed in poor weather. Exact house formations could vary, but often houses would be built with 2 levels. Maybe a big room on the main level for eating and cooking, etc., and then a loft area for sleeping. And under the loft area would be the stable. In cold weather, the animals could be sheltered and their body heat could help warm the people sleeping above them. We've already established that it probably wasn't cold enough at this time of year to force animals indoors. So by offering the stable area instead of the sleeping room, Joseph's family was maybe saying, hey, you're about to give birth. Have this quieter, private space in our house. The presence of animals. A very common theme in Christmas storybooks is animals. All the animals gather around the newborn baby and try to do different things to help him or soothe him to sleep. And this is very cute. And some of these books are more well done than others, and I can appreciate the goal of involving the children reading the book. What does the cow say? What does the sheep say? But none of these books are especially accurate. Based on the cultural and archaeological evidence available to us, the presence of most of the animals pictured in these books is unlikely. A big part of this is the time of year. If it's warm enough for the animals to be in pastures or staked outside, they are unlikely to be brought inside, especially when the stable is being used by an expectant mother. But if we ignore this and assume that all the animals owned by the family were in fact in the stable, let's consider which animals would have been most likely. Sheep and goats were likely to be owned by the family, but again, Luke has them out in the fields with the shepherds, so maybe the shepherds brought some of them with them when they visited. That's possible. It's also possible that the family owned a donkey, but donkeys often accompany flocks to the fields or could be staked somewhere outside, so again, not likely to be in the stable. As a side note, most stories depict Mary riding a donkey, and as far as I know, we have no evidence to corroborate that. Horses, cows, and camels would likely only be owned by the very wealthiest of families, so the presence of these is somewhat unlikely. Some sort of bird is fairly likely. Dovecotes have been found all over Israel, so that seems like the most likely bird to be present. I haven't done any research on the presence of chickens at the time, but I would imagine that it's possible. Then we come to pet-like animals. Dogs and cats are both theoretically possible, though considering how they are viewed by people living in the area today, I would consider cats the more likely. Dogs don't always have a good reputation. But I couldn't find direct evidence of Jews in the area at that time keeping domesticated cats. Lastly, mice and other pets. Then, as now, it's difficult to keep all such animals out of the house, so the presence of a mouse is not impossible. But if the mice were doing their part to worship the Christ child, then that is truly a miracle.
And definitely no pigs.
The absence of people. While animals are almost always pictured as being present for the birth of the baby, People other than Mary or Joseph are almost never pictured. And this, again, is unlikely. The women of that area are unlikely to abandon a young woman to give birth on her own, especially if she is staying in the family home. The women of the household would have been present in the stable, helping. Probably they would have also found a midwife or two to help. The three wise men. Several inaccuracies come up with the wise men. First off, they're often pictured as being present with the shepherds, but it's more likely they came weeks, months, or even years later. Second, our Western tradition at some point decided that 3 gifts means 3 wise men. We even have the song to commemorate it, "We Three Kings of Orient Are." This is a fairly late tradition. There's an Eastern tradition that says there were 12 wise men, but we have no evidence that I know of that gives the number of wise men. At least 2, since it's plural, but I think it's probably more than 3. There are also various traditions claiming to explain where the wise men were from, but all the Bible says is that they were from the East. One of the traditions, that claims there were 3 of them, also gives them names and 3 different regions of origin where they were kings or rulers. This is why they are so often portrayed with different skin colors and ethnicities. This is possible, but again, unlikely. More likely, they all came from the same area, but again, we can't be certain what area that is. I have heard reasonable arguments for Babylon, Persia, Ethiopia, and Nabatea, but I haven't necessarily found one significantly more convincing than another. They probably were not actually kings, though it's likely they were wealthy enough to be able to travel and well-studied enough to have a reason to travel. No Christmas storybook is perfect, but I do have some favorites. First, The Mouse in the Manger. While I quibble with the mouse being the central character in this retelling, I do really appreciate the artist's effort to make the architecture and geography make sense, and the author's work to include some relevant cultural details in the story. They even have a page at the end talking about the general structure of first century houses. If you want to be able to visualize the story in first century Bethlehem, this is the best book I've seen yet. The Christmas Cat. This starts out as another animal-themed book, but transitions to something that feels like it could have happened. A kitten could have befriended the baby Jesus and comforted him in his childhood and on their flight to Egypt. I also love the detail that a picture by Leonardo da Vinci inspired the story. Mary's Story. This story has many of the inaccuracies that I've mentioned, but I do love that it really centers Mary's experience, even though it doesn't get all the details right. I also enjoyed the art style. Something about it feels more authentic to the ethnic and economic realities of the Middle East, whereas many other books have more of a white European feel to them. The Wise Men Who Found Christmas. I haven't looked closely at this one, but I like that it avoids some of the common errors. It locates the wise men in a specific geographic region, Petra, rather than some vaguely eastern area.
And it pays some attention to history and geography.
How about you? Do you have a favorite Christmas storybook? Are there other inaccuracies that bother you? Leave me a comment, and until I see you again, have a lovely holiday season.